Thanks, Sergio. Thanks for the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you are all well in these current times, as Sergio said. Looking forward to the next hour to discussing this topic around talent identification, development systems. This idea around, I guess, friend or foe, good or bad, etc. As Sergio says, this a big research area of mine, and hope to share a few thoughts in the 15-minute presentation, and then look forward to some questions afterwards. So let's get this started. So I guess just I think a good place to start with is the IOC consensus statement on youth athletic development that was published in 2015. They actually open up their paper with this quote around that for everyone working with youth athletes, the goal is pretty clear, and that is to develop healthy, capable, resilient young athletes while attaining widespread, inclusive, sustainable and enjoyable participation and success for all levels of individual athletic achievement. So it's very much focusing on everyone and really around developing young people. And within that paper, one of the main sort of aspects of that is focusing around, I guess, this idea of talent. And it is actually quite a strong element of their paper, even though they open it with that. So if we think of talent and the importance of it, and talent is definitely a essential component to coaching, to sport science and athlete development. So it's a really intriguing topic area that covers so many aspects of those disciplines that really means it's quite complex, and we really need to try and get to the bottom of this. And I guess one of the interesting things around talent and understanding talent is that really sort of everyone's got an opinion on this, and whether that is top level managers in their respective roles, such as Gareth Southgate as the England manager, or whether that is just somebody in front of the TV watching a game, everyone's got an opinion on what is talent, okay? And that may be somebody down at the park watching a game of football or rugby down there. Everyone's got an opinion on it. So it makes it really intriguing and exciting to start to unravel this and understand what it's about. And I guess over the last probably 15 to 20 years, this idea of talent has probably become even more popularized when we look at the end outcomes of professional sport and the rewards associated with those. So if we consider Olympic-based sports and winning gold medals in those events as a real big outcome of our Olympic sports system, and we also then consider other professional sports and the rewards of winning such trophies, etc., and even just remaining in the Premiership and the financial rewards behind it, again, it's sort of exemplified how important this idea of talent is. Okay, and I guess to support both these Olympic-based elements, but also the professional sporting elements, over recent years, again, over the last 15 to 20 years, we've seen this idea of a talent identification and development system very much develop over that time period. That now these are very, a lot more common, or can traditionally be known as an academy in relation to developing players to achieve those end outcomes. And ultimately, a talent identification and development system is around taking standard practice, okay, and ultimately making that a higher quality. So how can we improve the quality of the coaching, the service that's provided to players to increase the quality and the standards of that ultimately allows people to progress within these systems? And that is really why talent ID and development systems have really increased a lot over the last 20 years. So I think an important starting point is really to understand this talent identification development processes, what is involved in that. And for people that have seen, I guess, a couple of my presentations before will be quite familiar with this slide. But ultimately, back in 2000, Mark Williams, Tom Riley proposed this idea of talent ID and development processes, which at the time involved four: detection, identification, development, and selection. And then recently, the idea of talent transfer has been proposed as well. So these processes have been, again, around for a while. And I guess where we're going to focus today is primarily within a sport around identification, development, and selection. But detection is around, I guess, detecting athletes that are not currently involved in that sport that may be suitable and may have some characteristics that may be suitable to that. But then just to highlight these other definitions. So talent identification is around the process of recognizing participants with the potential being a key word here, to excel in a particular sport. Okay, so can we recognize those athletes that have got potential to progress and excel in that sport? Talent development is around providing the most suitable learning environment for athletes to realize that potential or accelerate their development. So what development processes can we put in place to work with those athletes to really allow that them to meet those requirements? And then lastly, the other one, talent selection. And this is important to identify, make clear in relation to differences between identification and selection, is around the selection of players at various stages who demonstrate those prerequisite standards of performance and therefore are included in a particular team or squad. So selection is very much around current performance standards, whereas identification is around that recognizing those people with potential. And then transfer, I guess, is for those that have been in a sport but actually could have certain characteristics or history that may then allow them to transfer into another sport. And we've seen recent initiatives to develop talent transfer programs. So there's some of the talent ID and development processes involved within that. Again, if we then look at this within a system, okay, we're quite common within sport that this talent ID and development occurs in a sort of pyramidal system where we start with a normative population, okay, normally a community-based sport, and then players are identified from that population. It's selected into the next level or a higher level, okay? That could be a junior representative team. And what we see is that these selections occur with increasing up the pathway up until the professional or Olympic level. Now, it's not, although it is a pyramidal system, it's not a linear system. And we can see in the figure there that there's lots of arrows coming in and out in relation to non-retention of players, that players withdraw or drop out, athletes may transfer in from other sports. So it's definitely not a linear process. But ultimately, as those stages of development go up the pathway, what we ultimately see is that the number of opportunities or the number of places within that level decreases. So there's less athletes there, okay? But the support and the provision that's provided within those pathways or programs increases. Okay, so that could be in terms of the intensity of training, the level of competition, the coaching facilities, other disciplinary support that's provided. Okay, so that increases as the pathway it goes on. Now, if we this is where this idea around, I guess, friend or foe comes in, and if we consider that sort of debate around whether this is good or bad, okay, ultimately depends on who the people are, and two real key questions have been raised in relation to this idea of a talent ID and development system. The first one is, who ultimately gets these opportunities or does not get these opportunities? So who are those athletes in the black? Okay, so for those in the black, it's definitely seen as a friendly system for those, but for them in the white, it could be seen as a detrimental, and they could actually drop out of sport in the long term. So we need to consider who gets these opportunities from a talent identification perspective. And then the second question is around how appropriate and healthy are the development systems for those that get selected. So again, for some, that's going to be a friendly and positive, and for others, that may be a negative experience. But ultimately, there are two sort of key questions from question one from a talent ID perspective, question two from a talent development perspective. So recently, myself and Professor Joe Baker who I'm sure you're aware of from his work in this space, we wrote a paper that was published in Frontiers, and what we wanted to do was, I guess, propose some of the challenges and some possible solutions to optimizing these talent identification development systems. Now, what we wanted to do within this was there is a range of literature that's highlighted some of the challenges and critiqued some of the research, but there's probably not that much out there that is actually quite relevant to the practitioner. Okay, and we really wanted to summarize some of those literature and our thoughts to really help move this field forward and really progress the field, and ultimately start to create some discussion and debate around some of the challenges that are seen, and ultimately how we can help more people overcome those. So within the paper, we very much wrote this from both a practical perspective and a research and science perspective. So the paper is for ultimately everybody. It's for practitioners working in the field, but also for researchers in this space. And as sort of Sergio introduced me, I'm quite I've got strong opinions on this and how we work, because ultimately for me, whatever side of this sort of continuum you fall on, we are working towards the same goal. And if we go back to that goal, about that clear goal from the IOC, it's around really developing youth athletes to be successful in sport, whatever their level. So there's definitely work that we need to do in relation to sort of bridging that gap between research and practice, or science and practice, and how we can ultimately do that. And that is what we tried to do within the paper. And we also tried to do that by, I guess, providing recommendations and challenges and solutions across, I guess, the micro level of sporting systems, from the coach, the scout, the athlete, to club-based, the meso level, to the macro in terms of governing bodies. So we did try and cover quite a lot of space. And for those that have read the paper, there is probably quite a lot in there, which is very difficult for me to go through in 15 minutes, but I'm going to try and explain some of the thinking behind that over the next 5 to 10 minutes. So the first place I'd like to start is going through some of those challenges. So on the left, you can see that we've got ultimately the ages that of sport from 7 years old through to senior athletes. Okay. And obviously the first stage of that process is from a talent identification perspective. So we know that various sports have different timings when their talent identification occurs. So some sports may identify athletes as young as 6 or 7, where some sporting systems will identify players much later, around 16 to 18 years of age. Excuse me. But ultimately, there's some challenges and issues around this idea of talent identification here. And the first one is that, are we clear on what is talent? Okay. And ultimately, what does talent look like? And again, this is where these ideas between the practitioner and the researcher is quite important, because ultimately both can lead to misconceptions here. So have practitioners got a clear idea what is meant by the definition talent? Okay, that it's looking to provide opportunity in the future, and is dynamic and emergenic. Okay, and is non-linear. But also research doesn't necessarily help, because of a lot of methodologies that are implemented in practice are cross-sectional. Okay, and ultimately only measuring current performance. Okay, so this idea around performance potential is quite key. And again, this figure is becoming more popular, that was developed by Joe Baker in relation to that. From an identification perspective, we need to consider both potential of an athlete and performance of an athlete to therefore be able to make an accurate decision. Okay, so this is definitely the first challenge in relation to research and practice around understanding what is talent. Secondly, what we need to do is to be able to understand the output. So what I mean by the output is, what are we aiming to develop, identify and develop players for? Okay. And this is where we need to have a clear understanding of sports performance. Okay. So what are the demands of the sport? What do successful athletes look like? Sorry. And again, this is a challenge. There's emerging research that's starting to look at sports performance and the demands of sport in detail. Okay, but ultimately, if we identify somebody at 11 years of age, and identification occurs there, their potential to be that senior player is probably at least 8 years away, if not 10 or more years away. So this idea around understanding sports performance is important, okay, but we also need to start to think around what does the future of that sport look like. And this is where we sometimes need a bit of a crystal ball to be able to understand what future sports looks like in 10, 12, 15 years, okay? So we need to understand current sporting performance, but we also need to understand the future sporting performance. And we could ultimately potentially get around this by having clearer performance models, while also coaches and practitioners within sport being really the drivers of creating the future. And Sergio has a nice paper on some ideas around that in relation to serial winning coaches and how they drive and create the future of the sport. So the third challenge then is that we also need to understand the input. And what I mean by the input is, how do we understand children and young people? So what are children and adolescents like? How do they develop? How do they differ? And what impacts upon this development? Okay. And what I mean by this is, I guess, in relation to, I guess, a biopsychosocial development perspective of children and young people. So if we're making an identification at 8 years of age, what is an 8-year-old like from a biopsychosocial perspective? And what are the variations that can occur from players to players that impacts upon those decisions? If we take an example around 13, 14 years of age in male athletes, then we know from a biological perspective that maturation is a key indicator, key element there that impacts upon talent identification. Okay, so we need to understand, alongside understanding the output and sporting performance, we also need to understand the input. And we need to understand children and young people through pediatric exercise science. Okay, and this is where I guess practitioner education is key in relation to being able to do that, to allow people to make ethical and correct decisions in relation to that talent identification and development. So based upon this understanding of understanding sport and understanding children and young people, that would hopefully allow us to make better informed talent identification decisions, and also understanding what is talent. Therefore, making informed decisions using multidisciplinary, objective, subjective information that considers different elements of biopsychosocial development in relation to those people, to ultimately, hopefully, make a more informed decision. Okay. And alongside that, we then can start to look at how we can scaffold. So dependent on that, the timing of that identification, we can start to look at the talent development system. So how do we plan, scaffold, monitor this journey from a technical, tactical, physical, psychosocial perspective to allow players to develop on those pathways towards that end outcome of developing sport performance? And ultimately, this is very complex. The next element of that is that there's these systems, talent ID and development systems, have been criticised for two main things in relation to the health implications and early specialisation being part of that. So alongside developing players for sporting performance, athletes for sporting performance, we also need to ensure that there's clear health outcomes within that, and we try and minimise those negative outcomes such as overtraining, injury, etc. And ultimately, that comes down to having an athlete-centered talent development environment that tries to promote those positive outcomes and minimise those negative outcomes as much as possible. Okay, and this builds upon some of the work from a colleague of mine, Fika Ronda. Okay, so we've got 6 areas here in relation to talent identification, development, health, etc. But ultimately, the last challenge is that these elements are all influenced by the resource that's available. Okay, and within the paper, we propose resource in relation to 3 areas: athlete-related resource, so what resources in the system relate to the athlete, what resources provided for education of coaches to allow them to do a better job with this, or practitioners, and how is research resource we considered within this as well to allow us to continue to make developments and progress this pathway. So ultimately, what I've tried to cover there in the last 5 minutes is the complexity of talent ID and development systems and those processes around how complex that ultimately is. So to go back to the question that we pose in the session is, so our talent identification and development systems, are they a friend or foe? And I touched upon this before, but ultimately, a talent ID and development systems they're neither inherently good or bad. Instead, how they're perceived, their impact reflects upon how well they are designed, implemented, and managed to develop, I guess, back to the goal of the IOC, healthy, capable, and resilient young people, whatever pathway they are in. So obviously the answer is we can't really answer that, but we've got to, I guess, consider that within there, and that importance of the design of the system, the implementation of the system and the program, and how that's managed by a range of different stakeholders is key. And we conclude the paper by focusing again on talent and sort of questioning what is talent, in that we know it's complex, we know it's difficult to measure, we know it's non-linear, we know it's potentially unhealthy. And therefore, based upon this and the available evidence at the minute, I guess our recommendation is that we try and apply appropriate research-informed practices to everyone, or as many as possible, if that can't be everyone, for as long as possible, okay, to increase the opportunities that people get, their performance and skill, and their health in the long term. So very much sort of starting to forget around this issue, this idea of talent, especially with younger people, and just try and getting better practices to more people for as long as possible. Okay, thank you for listening. That's me trying to cover the this area in, I probably went over the 15 minutes, but hopefully there were some interesting things to take away, and I look forward to some questions.